James Melendez, James the Wine Guy, here to talk about how I rate wines. Stay tuned. So a lot of people have asked me how I came up with the system, how I use it, and some conjecture of how I've used it, and even thoughts on how I've utilized and applied my wine reviews to wines in general and for regions. Now, I think probably the number one question is how I get there. I think ultimately I don't use an additive or deductive system. That is, I don't go down from 10 or 100 points downward, deducting down for flaws or things that are not perfect, but I also don't use additive either. And the reason I don't do that is that if you look at these systems, they tend to have a boilerplate ideal. That is, maybe a Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon is the most ideal. Maybe a Shiraz from McLaren Vale is ideal. Maybe a Pinot Blanc coming from Alsace is the ideal. I moved away from that. I don't want to be part of that kind of, I would say, overly idealistic system, because in practice it doesn't work. Simply this: there are many wine producing regions around the planet that are not producing exact copies of each other, and that's a really important thing to think about. Ultimately, when I look at this, I had to really use maybe within peers, so specific variety and specific varieties within a certain region, and how are those wines tasting, because they express differently. Say Napa Valley is a good example of how each sub-AVA or American viticultural area next to each other, how they express. Well, they're going to be very much more closer, not necessarily exactly the same in terms of sub-region, sub-AVA to another sub-AVA. So I try not to use Parker and Company system, because for me there's just too many 100-point wines. And ultimately it's coming up to, what is that ideal wine? What is that perfect wine? Well, I would say that perfection in general doesn't exist, or if it does, we won't recognize it if it did happen. So I'm very, very careful to not use that. I really want my numbers to mean something. I don't want to disinvalidate my system. So I want to use much more rigor and be much more careful in my system. So a 9.2 is more difficult to get than, say, a 9.1. Those numbers can also be translated. So I have a 10-point system, and I'm also very, very flexible to go to a 100-point system. The reason I didn't begin with a 100-point system is I didn't want to go back to, using that boilerplate of Parker and Company. I want to be much more disciplined and, use that rigor of that logarithm. So, you can look at my numbers and say anything above, say, 95 point or 9.5 is pretty rare in my total thousands of reviews that I've given. And I've looked at that and said, I feel comfortable with that. I really enjoy doing that. I also want to make sure that I don't throw one region under the proverbial bus in place of another region, uplifting that region. It just doesn't make any sense to do that. So the other part is I don't look at producers' websites or printed materials with scores. If I see them, I really want to put it away. I don't want to look at that. I also don't want to look at the descriptors of what they're doing. I want some technical information. That's all I want. And I'm not really worried how I rate it, if it's too high or too low. I feel very, very comfortable with that. And so I really want to be, careful with how I rate wines. I also want to be disciplined with myself, because I don't want to disinvalidate my own system. And I also want to, I also am very, very sensitive to knowing that, guess what, there's people behind this wine that made this wine. So I think there are some people that I'm aware of that, give some really harsh scores, and not realizing or caring that there are people behind that. And it's not to, give an artificial number, but it's also to be, giving that discipline to one's own scoring system and making sure that that is within line. Because if somebody's idealizing a specific wine from another region and they're tasting from another region that is not part of that region, well, guess what? I think one might win out over the other, as opposed to saying, I'm going to try to review within that peer set. So the peer set means within that region. Thank you so much for watching. If you have more questions, listen down below. You can also do that on a variety of social medias. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, LinkedIn, as well as Instagram and WordPress. So do me a favor, give a like to this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned for more wine reviews and general wine subject matters to come. Thank you again for watching. Salud.